August 19th, 1945, 1400 hours. Processing Center C, Oahu, Hawaii. The heat inside the corrugated tin hangar was suffocating, smelling of diesel fumes, DDT powder, and stale sweat. The hum of a Willys MB Jeep idling near the entrance vibrated through the concrete floor. Keiko Tanaka, formerly a nurse's aide in the Imperial Field Hospital on Okinawa, stared at her own dust-caked feet. Her breathing was shallow. The shame of survival burned in her throat like bile. Around her, other female detainees sat in silence, waiting for the shouting of the American GIs to begin, the inevitable, rough handling, the barking of orders they couldn't understand. "All right, listen up. Line forms here. Have your tags ready." The voice wasn't a bark. It was sharp, alto, and undeniably female. Keiko's head snapped up. Walking down the line was not a hulking Marine, but a figure in a crisp, khaki, tropical worsted uniform. The figure wore a skirt, hemmed strictly below the knee, and a hobby hat with the gold Pallas Athene insignia catching the light. She held a clipboard like a weapon. The American woman stopped in front of a male MP who was slouching against a crate. She pointed a manicured finger at him, said something low and cutting. The male soldier immediately straightened, saluted, and scrambled to move a heavy crate of K-rations. Keiko blinked, the cognitive dissonance hitting her like a physical blow. A woman commanding a man? In uniform? The American officer turned, her eyes scanning the row of prisoners, her gaze locked onto Keiko. 3 weeks earlier, inside the hold of a transport ship. If you enjoy these historical deep dives, please subscribe and comment below with your country's history of women in service. The vibration was the first thing Keiko felt, a constant, bone-rattling tremor that traveled up through the steel deck plates and into her spine. It was the heartbeat of the beast, a massive American Liberty ship plowing through the Pacific swells. Keiko Tanaka sat huddled against the cold, sweating rivets of the ship's hull. The air in the cargo hold was thick, a soupy mix of diesel oil, seasickness, and the unwashed bodies of 300 women. They were the leftovers of the Empire's collapse, nurses, clerical staff, and civilians swept up in the dragnet of the surrender. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the sobbing of the young girl next to her. Shame, Keiko thought, the word echoing in her mind like a mantra. To live is shame. We should have found a grenade. We should have found a cliff. But there had been no cliffs, only the terrifying speed of the American advance and the sudden, blinding silence of the surrender order. "Water," a voice croaked nearby. Keiko opened her eyes. A metal canteen was being passed down the line. It was stamped with U.S. The letters seemed to mock her. When it reached her, she hesitated. To drink their water was to accept their sustenance, to fuel the body that should be dead. Her thirst won. She took a sip. The water was metallic and warm, but it soothed the sandpaper dryness of her throat. "Where are they taking us?" the young girl whispered, wiping her nose on a torn sleeve. "To the mainland? To be slaves?" "It does not matter," Keiko said, her voice flat, devoid of the comfort a nurse should offer. "We are ghosts now." The ship's engine pitch changed. The rhythmic thrumming slowed, followed by the colossal grinding screech of the anchor chain being let out. The sound was deafening, like the earth itself tearing open. Light flooded the hold as the hatch above groaned open. A square of blinding blue sky appeared, framing the silhouette of a soldier holding a Thompson submachine gun. "Let's go! Move it! Topside!" the voice bellowed down. Keiko stood up, her legs trembling from days of inactivity. She smoothed her dirty Monpe trousers. She prepared herself to see the monsters. She prepared herself for the brutality she had been warned about in the pamphlets, the giant men who would treat them like cattle. She climbed the ladder, step by heavy step, rising from the darkness into the blinding Pacific sun. She didn't know it yet, but the monsters she was expecting would not be the ones waiting on the dock. The transition from the ship to the truck was a blur of shouting and shoving, but the arrival at the camp was shockingly precise. The trucks ground to a halt in a cloud of red Hawaiian dust. "Disembark, line up, single file." Keiko stumbled off the tailgate, her knees buckling on the gravel. The sun was merciless here, sharper than in Okinawa. Ahead of them lay a sprawling grid of tents and Quonset huts, surrounded by high chain-link fences topped with barbed wire. It looked less like a prison and more like a factory. She kept her head down, clutching her meager bundle of possessions against her chest. The air was filled with a strange, rhythmic clatter. Clack, clack, ding, clack, clack, ding, like 100 machine guns firing in slow motion. As the line shuffled forward into the shade of a large open-sided hangar, the source of the noise became clear. It wasn't gunfire. It was typewriters. Dozens of tables were arranged in perfect rows. Behind each table sat an American soldier. Keiko braced herself for the harsh glares of men. She froze. The soldier at the nearest table was a woman. She wore a crisp khaki uniform that fit tailored to her waist, a tie tucked neatly between the collars of her shirt. On her head perched a stiff, peaked cap with a gold insignia, the head of a Greek goddess. Keiko stared. In her world, women in war were wrapped in manpe or white nurse aprons, scurrying in the background, heads bowed. This woman sat with a straight spine, her fingers hammering the keys of a black Remington No. 17 with terrifying efficiency. "Next," the woman said, not looking up. An MP shoved Keiko forward. She stood before the desk, trembling. The American woman stopped typing. She looked up, her face devoid of the cruelty Keiko expected, but also devoid of warmth. It was a look of pure, bored bureaucracy. She adjusted a stack of carbon paper, her fingernails clean and filed. "Name?" the woman asked, her pen hovering over a form. An interpreter stood nearby, translating the bark into Japanese. "Tanaka. Keiko," she whispered. The woman typed it out. Clack, clack, clack. The sound was violent, deliberate. She ripped a cardboard tag from a perforated sheet and slid it across the table. "Move along. Medical check is next tent over." Keiko took the tag. It felt heavy, like a stone. She looked back as she was ushered away. The American woman was already shouting at a male corporal who had dropped a file box. "Watch it, soldier. That's the master roster," she snapped. The male corporal mumbled an apology and picked it up. Keiko's breath hitched. The world had tilted on its axis. A woman had just commanded a man, and the air inside the second tent was thick with a chemical haze that tasted of chalk and poison. Keiko gagged as she was pushed through the heavy canvas flaps. The smell was overpowering, acrid and dry. "Close off, everything, now." The order came from an interpreter, but the authority came from the American standing beside a wooden crate. She was a tall woman, wearing HBT, herringbone twill fatigues, her sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms flecked with white powder. Keiko hesitated. In the Imperial Army hospitals, nudity was clinical, but here, surrounded by enemies, it felt like a prelude to execution. Around her, the other women were weeping softly as they unbuttoned their torn shirts. Keiko swallowed her pride. She would not cry. She undressed, folding her manpe with trembling hands, placing them on the pile. She stood shivering, naked and exposed. The tall American woman stepped forward. In her hand was a metal canister with a pump handle, a DDT sprayer. "Arms up," the woman said. She didn't shout. She sounded tired. Keiko raised her arms. Whoosh! A cloud of white powder blasted into her armpits, then down her front and into her hair. It choked her, coating her skin in a ghostly layer. Keiko squeezed her eyes shut, expecting a blow to follow, but there was only the rough brush of a hand turning her around. Whoosh! Her back was dusted. "Next station," the woman grunted, shoving Keiko gently but firmly toward a row of cots. Keiko stumbled forward, wiping the chemical grit from her eyelashes. A second woman was waiting. This one wore the caduceus collar insignia of the medical corps. Around her neck hung a stethoscope with heavy black rubber tubing. The medic didn't look at Keiko's face. She looked at her body like a mechanic inspecting a fuselage. She grabbed Keiko's wrist, her fingers strong and calloused, checking the pulse. Thump, 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 thump. Keiko watched. The medic's face. There was no malice. There was no leering. There was only efficiency. The medic placed the cold metal disc of the stethoscope against Keiko's ribcage. "Deep breath," the interpreter said. Keiko inhaled. She knew this ritual. She had performed it 1,000 times on wounded soldiers in Okinawa, but she had never been the patient. She had never felt the terrifying powerlessness of the one being examined. The medic pulled the stethoscope away and scribbled something in a medical logbook. She grabbed Keiko's chin, forcing her mouth open to check her gums for scurvy. The grip was tight, bordering on painful, but it was precise. "Clear," the medic said, marking a check on Keiko's tag. "Get dressed. Move to Sector 4. Keiko scrambled to retrieve her clothes, shaking the white powder from them. As she pulled her trousers on, she looked back. The medic was already grabbing the wrist of the next prisoner, her face a mask of focus. Keiko buttoned her shirt, her heart rate slowly stabilizing. They hadn't hurt her. They hadn't violated her. They had treated her like a machine that needed servicing. She walked out into the blinding sunlight of the main compound, the white DDT powder on her hair, marking her like snow. She was alive. She was clean. And she was utterly confused. Keiko sat in the dirt near the perimeter fence of Sector 4. The afternoon heat distorted the air above the tarmac, making the distant hangars shimmer. For 2 days, she had watched. She watched them march. She watched them salute. But she still couldn't understand them. A cloud of dust announced the arrival of a vehicle. A Willys MB Jeep, battered and mud-stained, sputtered toward the supply depot opposite Keiko's enclosure. With a loud bang and a hiss of steam, the engine died. The driver, a burly male sergeant, slammed his hands against the steering wheel. He hopped out, kicked the tire, and threw the hood open, waving his arms in frustration. Smoke billowed out. "Need a hand, Sarge?" Keiko watched as a figure slid out from under a nearby truck on a creeper. It was a woman. She wasn't wearing the skirt and tie Keiko had seen earlier. She was covered head to toe in baggy, grease-stained HBT coveralls, her hair tucked entirely under a mechanic's cap. The male sergeant put his hands on his hips. "Damn carburetor again. Piece of junk." The woman stood up. She was small compared to him, but she walked with a heavy, grounded stride. She wiped her hands on a rag that was already black with oil. Without asking for permission, she leaned into the engine bay of the Jeep. Keiko pressed her face against the chain-link fence. In Japan, a woman might clean the factory floor or assemble delicate fuses. But this was a machine of war. This was steel and fire. The American woman barked an order. The sergeant, a man who could snap her in half, jumped into the driver's seat. "Crank it," she yelled. The engine whined but didn't catch. The woman shook her head. She pulled a heavy socket wrench from her back pocket. She dove back under the hood, her body disappearing into the machinery. Keiko could see her elbows working, the muscles in her forearms flexing as she wrenched a bolt tight. "Try it now!" The sergeant hit the starter. The engine roared to life, purring smoothly. The woman emerged grinning. She wiped a smudge of grease across her forehead, leaving a black streak like war paint. The sergeant gave her a thumbs up and drove off. The woman turned, spinning the wrench in her hand. She looked toward the fence. Through the diamond-shaped wire, her eyes locked with Keiko's. Keiko didn't look away. She couldn't. She looked at the grease on the woman's hands, the filth that signaled mastery, not servitude. The cognitive dissonance cracked something open inside her. If they could fix the engines that carried the guns, what else were they capable of? The American mechanic didn't smile. She just gave a single, slight nod, then turned back to her truck. The mess hall was a cavernous structure echoing with the clatter of tin against steel. The smell was confusing, a mix of boiled cabbage, strong coffee, and the faint, sweet scent of canned fruit. It was more food than Keiko had smelled in months, yet her stomach knotted with anxiety. The line moved slowly. At the serving station, a sweating male corporal with hairy forearms slammed ladles of stew onto the metal mess trays. He didn't look at the women. He looked through them. When Keiko reached the front, she held out her tray with both hands, bowing slightly, a reflex she couldn't suppress. The corporal sneered. He scooped a half portion of watery broth, purposely avoiding the chunks of meat and potatoes in the pot. He splattered it onto her tray, missing the compartment and soaking her bread. "Move it, Tojo," he muttered, waving the ladle like a club. Keiko froze. The insult was in English, but the tone was universal. She stepped back, eyes lowered, accepting the humiliation as the price of defeat. "Corporal!" The voice cut through the din like a whip crack. The corporal flinched, dropping the ladle into the stew with a splash. Standing at the end of the serving line was the woman from the processing center, Captain Miller. She stood with her hands clasped behind her back, her posture rigid. The silver twin bars of a captain glinted on her collar. "Ma'am?" the corporal stammered, straightening up but not quite snapping to attention. "Is there a shortage of rations I wasn't informed of?" Miller asked. Her voice was low, dangerous. She walked slowly toward him, her heels clicking rhythmically on the concrete. "No, ma'am. Just rationing for the prisoners, ma'am." "The Geneva Convention, Article 11, Miller recited, pointing to a sheet of paper tacked to the wall behind him. "Rations shall be equal in quantity and quality to those of depot. Troops. Do not make me write you up for a violation of international law, Corporal. Fill that tray." The mess hall went silent. The Japanese women watched, wide-eyed. The corporal's face flushed red. He looked at Keiko, then at the captain. He hated it. He hated taking orders from a woman, and he hated feeding the enemy. But he feared the rank. He scooped a full ladle of meat and potatoes and dumped it onto Keiko's tray. "Thank you," Miller said, ice cold. She turned her gaze to Keiko. It wasn't a look of kindness. It was a look of enforced order. "I do this for the rule, not for you," her eyes seemed to say. Keiko bowed deeper this time, not to the man, but to the silver bars on the woman's collar. She hurried to a table, her heart pounding. The world she knew, where men ruled and women obeyed, was dissolving with every mouthful of the American stew. 3 days later, the whisper ran through the barracks like an electric current. "Inspection. The Red Cross is coming." Keiko knelt beside Etsuko, a young girl from Osaka who was burning with fever. Etsuko was curled tightly under a wool blanket, shivering violently. In the Imperial Army, the sick were often left behind or worse. Keiko knew she had to hide her. "Stay quiet," Keiko whispered, pulling the blanket up to cover Etsuko's flushed face. "If they find you, they will take you away." Outside, the crunch of boots on gravel grew louder. The door to the Quonset hut swung open. "Attention!" The women scrambled to stand at the foot of their cots. Keiko stood directly in front of Etsuko's bunk, trying to make herself look wider, trying to shield the trembling lump of blankets. Captain Miller entered, accompanied by a man wearing a civilian suit and a white armband with a red cross. They moved slowly down the aisle. The captain didn't shout today. She pointed at ventilation gaps, checked the tension of the canvas cots, and made notes on a clipboard filled with carbon copy forms. The silence was suffocating. Every scratch of the pen sounded like a sentence. They stopped at Keiko's bunk. Miller's eyes narrowed. She looked at Keiko, standing rigid and sweating, then at the blanket behind her that was moving slightly. "Step aside," Miller said. Keiko didn't move. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She prepared to be struck. She prepared to fight. Miller stepped closer, towering over Keiko. "I said, step aside." Keiko squeezed her eyes shut and stepped to the left. Miller pulled the blanket back. Etsuko gasped, shielding her eyes from the light. The civilian man leaned in, touching Etsuko's forehead. He said something to Miller in a low voice. "Typhus? Malaria?" Keiko braced herself for the order to drag Etsuko out to be shot. Instead, Miller turned to the doorway. "Medic, get a stretcher in here. We have a fever of 104. 2 WAC medics rushed in, carrying a canvas litter. They didn't drag Etsuko. They lifted her with practiced care, tucking the blanket around her feet. Miller looked at Keiko. "Why didn't you report this at roll call?" Keiko stared at the floor, unable to articulate the fear that had kept her silent. "We are not barbarians," Miller said, her voice dropping the command tone for a split second. "She needs quinine, not a grave." They carried Etsuko out. Keiko stood alone in the aisle, the sound of the clipboard snapping shut echoing in her ears. The enemy was saving them. The dissonance was gone, replaced by a terrifying clarity. We were wrong about everything, but clarity came too late. From the medical tent outside, a sudden shout erupted. "She's seizing! I need help!" Keiko didn't think. The scream cut through her hesitation like a scalpel. She sprinted toward the medical tent, ignoring the shouts of the guards. Inside, chaos reigned. Etsuko was thrashing violently on the canvas cot, her back arching, foam gathering at the corners of her mouth. The wooden legs of the cot rattled against the concrete floor. Thud, 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 thud. A young American WAC medic, no older than 20, was struggling to hold Etsuko's shoulders down. She was shouting for a doctor, but the tent was otherwise empty. "She's biting her tongue! Hold her!" The medic screamed at the air, panic rising in her voice. Keiko burst through the flap. The MP guard was right behind her, reaching for his baton. "Get back!" Keiko ignored him. She saw the blood mixed with saliva on Etsuko's lips. The young WAC was losing her grip. Keiko dove. She didn't attack the American. She mirrored her. Keiko grabbed Etsuko's flailing legs, pinning them down with her full body weight. She looked the American medic in the eye and nodded sharply. "I have her." The medic blinked, stunned for a fraction of a second, then understood. She grabbed a wooden tongue depressor from the tray. "Open! Open up!" Etsuko's jaw was clamped shut in a rictus of seizure. The medic couldn't get the leverage. Keiko let go of the legs, a dangerous risk, and lunged forward. She used her thumbs to press hard into the pressure points behind Etsuko's jawbone, a technique drilled into her at the Okinawa Field Hospital. Etsuko's mouth slackened just enough. The American jammed the wooden stick between Etsuko's molars, keeping the airway clear. "Turn her! Lateral!" Keiko shouted in Japanese, using her hands to mime the motion. The language meant nothing, but the movement was universal. Recovery position. Together, moving as a single unit, the American soldier and the Japanese prisoner heaved Etsuko onto her side to prevent her from choking on the vomit. They froze there, panting, their hands entangled on the patient's sweating shoulder. Slowly, the violent convulsions eased into tremors. Etsuko gasped, drawing a ragged, clear breath. The silence that followed was deafening. The MP stood at the entrance, baton lowered, confused by the scene. Before him, Keiko looked up. Across the cot, The young American medic was staring at her. Sweat dripped from the American's nose. There was no hatred in her eyes anymore. There was only the exhausted recognition of a fellow professional. "Nice work," the medic breathed, her voice trembling. Keiko didn't understand the words, but she felt the tone. She slowly pulled her hands away from Etsuko. Her fingers were trembling. For the first time since the surrender, she didn't feel like a prisoner of war, and she felt like a nurse. November 1945? The docks. The wind off the harbor smelled of salt and diesel, just as it had 3 months ago, but the air no longer felt heavy with dread. It felt thin, crisp, with the uncertainty of peace. Keiko stood in line at the base of the gangplank. In her hand, she clutched her repatriation papers, stamped with the official seal of the United States Army. Slung over her shoulder was a green canvas duffel bag, filled not with the remnants of defeat, but with chocolate, soap, and a wool blanket given to her by the camp staff. The processing was efficient, quiet, no shouting. "Tanaka, Keiko," a clerk called out. Keiko stepped forward. She handed over her papers. As she waited for the final stamp, she looked past the clerk to the jeep parked near the warehouse. Standing there, watching the prisoners' board, was Captain Miller. She looked exactly as she had on that first terrifying day in the hangar. The crisp khaki uniform, the skirt hemmed below the knee, and the hobby hat perched perfectly on her head. The gold Pallas Athene insignia caught the morning sun, the goddess of wisdom and war. 3 months ago, I saw a monster, Keiko thought. Now, I see a blueprint. Keiko stepped out of line, just an inch. The MP started to raise his hand, but Miller waved him off. The captain walked over, stopping a few feet from Keiko. There were no bows this time. "Good luck, Tanaka," Miller said. It wasn't warm, but it was respectful. It was the farewell of one soldier to another. Keiko stood straighter than she ever had in the presence of an emperor's officer. She looked at the gold insignia on Miller's collar, then raised her hand. Not in a bow, but in a slow, deliberate salute. Miller returned it, crisp and sharp. Keiko turned and walked up the gangplank. The metal vibrated under her feet, echoing the journey that brought her here. She touched the empty collar of her own rough shirt. Japan was in ruins, she knew. The cities were ash. The men were broken. "But we are not," she whispered to the wind. As the ship's horn blasted, a deep, mournful sound signaling departure, Keiko didn't look back at the wire fences. She looked forward, toward the horizon. She was returning to a land of ghosts, but she was bringing back something more dangerous than any weapon. The knowledge that a woman could hold a wrench, command a regiment, and save a life, all without lowering her eyes. The ship pulled away. The figure of Captain Miller became a small speck of khaki against the gray concrete, but the image of the Pallas Athene burned bright in Keiko's mind, guiding her home.